Have you ever waited for an apology that never came? Held your breath, thinking if you just explained yourself better, they'd finally understand? Have you ever typed a message, then deleted it, hoping silence would speak louder, but it never did? There's a pain more haunting than heartbreak. It's the pain of still needing answers from someone who's already moved on, of waiting for closure from a person who benefited from your confusion. You think, if they could just admit what they did, if I could just make them see. But they won't, and you won't. Because the truth is, you don't need closure, you need coldness. You don't need one last conversation. You need distance, boundaries, steel. Because closure implies they owe you clarity. But what they owe, they'll never pay. And what you need is not justice, it's detachment. This isn't about healing with their help. It's about freezing the wound before it bleeds out everything you still have left. Closure is one of the most seductive lies pain will whisper. It tells you that peace is just one conversation away, one message, one sincere apology, one moment of truth where everything will finally click. And we believe it, because it sounds like healing. But it isn't. It's obsession disguised as resolution. It's grief clinging to the fantasy that the one who broke you might one day become the one who repairs you. Closure convinces us to stay emotionally tethered to people who've already detached from us completely. You check your phone hoping they've come to their senses. You replay the last words over and over, searching for meaning like some ancient riddle you're destined to solve. But the truth is this: most people don't give closure because they don't care enough to. And if they did, they wouldn't have left you bleeding in silence. They would have stayed. They would have explained. They would have protected what they helped build. So you sit there thinking closure is coming, when really, coldness is the only thing that ever arrives. And it's not cruel, it's clarity. Marion Woodman once said, "Addiction is the refusal to be fully alive in the present." That's what waiting for closure becomes. An addiction to the unfinished, a devotion to a chapter that refuses to end. You think you're looking for peace, but what you're really craving is control. You want to make sense of the senseless. You want a reason. You want the power to wrap the story up on your terms. But healing doesn't always come with answers. It comes with decisions. Decisions that hurt. Decisions that feel like betrayal when you finally choose yourself over the hope that someone else might eventually do it for you. You scroll back through old messages, looking for signs. You reanalyze their tone, their timing, their pauses. But closure isn't found in old conversations. It's found in the moment you stop needing one. When you decide to stop handing your power to people who already showed you how little they could hold. When you stop performing emotional labor for people who watched you drown and asked why you didn't swim harder. Most people don't want to give you closure, because giving it would require them to acknowledge the damage they caused. And acknowledging that would cost them their comfort, their pride, their illusion of goodness. So they vanish. And when they do, you're left thinking it's your job to piece it all together. But it's not. Your job is to let the silence be the answer. Let the lack of explanation be the explanation. You don't need another conversation. You need a colder gaze, a tighter boundary, a refusal to chase what's clearly walking away. Because here's the harshest truth of all. Waiting for closure is self-abandonment in slow motion. You keep delaying your healing in hopes that the person who hurt you might become the person who saves you. But they won't. And the longer you wait, the deeper the wound sets in. The more your nervous system normalizes uncertainty. The more your mind turns the past into your prison. What you need isn't another dialogue. You need distance. Not soft, wistful distance. Hard, final, surgical distance. The kind of coldness that doesn't ask for permission. The kind that builds walls not out of spite, but out of self-respect. Coldness isn't cruelty. It's precision. It's when the heart says, "I've cried long enough." It's when the soul decides, "I deserve better than this ache." That's where your peace lives. Not in the next reply, but in the space you no longer fill with wishful thinking. In the next section, we'll explore what happens when you stop waiting for their words entirely, and how silence becomes the sharpest shield you'll ever carry. You keep waiting for a sentence that will never be spoken, some final phrase that will make the pain make sense. Maybe you imagine them saying, "I didn't know how to love you," or "You didn't deserve that," or even just, "I see it now." Something, anything, to prove you mattered. But here's the truth. If they wanted to say it, they already would have. Silence is the statement. It always was. The more time you spend decoding their absence, the more you become fluent in your own abandonment. You imagine closure as a moment of clarity, of calm. But real closure rarely comes wrapped in words. It comes in waves of grief, then rage, then detachment, and finally, indifference. The longer you chase their words, the more you lose your own. You think you're seeking peace. You're not. You're seeking reversal. You want them to break the silence so your story doesn't end the way it did. But that story already ended. They wrote their part in silence. Now you write yours in stone. As James Hollis once wrote, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parent. And the greatest burden an adult must bear is the unspoken apology that never arrives." You think their words will set you free. But would they? Would "I'm sorry" undo the nights you couldn't sleep? Would "you were right" heal the way you gaslighted yourself on their behalf? You want their confession to validate your pain, but your pain is already valid. It doesn't need permission. And the truth is, anyone who could have spoken and chose not to is telling you everything. Cowards avoid the truth, not because they don't know it, but because speaking it would cost them something. Ego, image, power. And if someone values those things more than your dignity, then what could they possibly say now that would change anything? You don't need an explanation from someone who built a home in your confusion. You don't need a response from someone who benefited from your silence. Their lack of words is a mirror. It shows you who they are. And in that silence, you're invited to meet who you are, not the version that begged to be seen, but the one who sees herself now, clearly, entirely, with no more waiting. Because the longer you wait, the more your life becomes a waiting room. You sit there, not moving forward, not falling apart, just frozen, hoping, replaying conversations that never happened. Meanwhile, the world moves on, and you forget what your voice sounds like when it's not asking why. So stop. Not because they're unworthy of forgiveness, but because you're worthy of freedom. Stop waiting for them to return with the right words. They won't. And even if they did, it would be too late. What you needed wasn't the apology. It was the protection that never came. What you longed for wasn't their voice. It was their presence, their truth, their consistency. You can't rewrite that, but you can end the echo. You can stop performing conversations in your head that always end the same way, with you feeling smaller. Silence them, not out of spite, but out of sovereignty. Because your healing begins where their words end. In the next section, we'll explore what happens when you reclaim the dialogue, and how speaking only to yourself becomes the most powerful act of liberation. They don't hear your silence, but you do. Every unsent message, every breath you held in, waiting for them to notice. Every night you played both sides of the conversation in your head, explaining, apologizing, begging, unraveling, but they never responded, not really. So you kept speaking to yourself, hoping they'd hear you through the walls of their indifference. Eventually, though, something shifts, not outside, inside. You stop speaking to them. You stop fantasizing about their realization, their remorse, and instead you turn the conversation inward. You ask yourself the question no one else could answer. Why was I so willing to be unheard? That's the moment everything begins. When the dialogue you've been trying to have with them becomes the one you finally have with yourself. Honest, brutal, healing, because the voice that needed to be heard was never theirs. It was yours. Buried beneath every compromise, every silence you swallowed. Stephen Grosz writes, Unspoken feelings never die. They are buried alive and come forth later in uglier ways. You realize now, this conversation isn't about them. It never was. It's about meeting the part of yourself you left behind while trying to be understood. And when you meet that part of yourself, you don't speak in cliches. You don't offer apologies. You tell the truth. You say, I stayed too long. I hoped too much. I gave what I didn't have to people who never asked me to stop. And there's pain in that, but also power. Because this conversation doesn't require agreement. It doesn't beg to be heard. It exists only to clarify. You see your patterns. You see the way you've chased people who mirror your childhood wounds. You see how silence from others feels like abandonment because you once learned to equate neglect with love. And in this seeing, you begin to separate. You stop blaming them, not to absolve, but to evolve. You speak to the younger version of yourself who thought being chosen was the same as being safe, and you tell them, we don't wait for crumbs anymore. You begin to parent yourself. You begin to protect yourself. And suddenly, the conversation isn't desperate. It's sacred. You start choosing your own company, not because you've given up, but because you've finally come home. From the outside, nothing looks different. You still go to work. You still drink your coffee. You still scroll past their name. But internally, the shift is seismic. You've pulled your energy back. You're no longer dangling emotional bait in the hopes they'll bite. You're no longer scripting fantasy reunions. You're not checking who watched your story. You've stopped talking to them in your mind. And that silence, it's the most powerful sound you've ever made. Because now you're speaking only to the part of you that always listened. The one who waited quietly in the dark while you screamed into voids hoping someone would echo back. That voice, yours, is steady now. And it tells you the truth. Not the comforting kind, the real kind. And with that truth comes peace. Not peace because the pain is gone, but peace because the power is back where it belongs. In the next section, we'll explore what happens when you stop asking the world to understand you, and how becoming emotionally cold can finally make you feel safe. At some point, warmth becomes a liability. Not because warmth is bad, but because too often you gave it to people who treated it like a weakness. You loved with softness, and they took it as an invitation to push your limits. You listened with empathy, and they used your compassion as a hiding place for their cruelty. Over time, you learned not everyone deserves access to your warmth. Not every wound should be wrapped in forgiveness. There is a kind of love that burns you alive, and the only thing that saves you from it is coldness. Not bitterness, not numbness, distance, precision, emotional discipline. A refusal to bleed where you're not respected. And this coldness, this withdrawal, is not a failure of your heart. It's the moment your nervous system stops living in survival mode. You are not becoming heartless, you are becoming safe. As Sylvia Brinton Perera wrote in Descent to the Goddess, to descend is to go inward, to choose the darkness of knowing over the illusion of light. And coldness is that descent. The sacred boundary between your peace and the world that keeps trying to provoke your surrender. It feels unnatural at first, especially if you've been conditioned to equate connection with closeness. But closeness isn't always safety. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones closest to you, the ones who smile when you're vulnerable and flinch when you show strength. Emotional coldness is not the absence of feeling, it's the mastery of it. It's the ability to feel deeply and still choose distance. It's the refusal to let your emotions be used against you. When you're cold, you don't suppress your heart. You protect it. You don't respond to bait. You don't rush to soothe discomfort. You observe. You calculate. You decide. You stop flinching at silence. You stop interpreting every pause as rejection. And most importantly, you stop needing people to like you in order to feel secure. Coldness, when chosen consciously, becomes a form of sovereignty. It teaches you to sit with your pain instead of outsourcing it. It teaches you to trust your intuition, not beg for reassurance. The old version of you needed warmth to feel human. The new you radiate a different kind of power, the kind that doesn't need to be seen to exist. And this is where your safety begins, not in how others treat you, but in how little you need their validation. You become your own sanctuary, your own shield. You don't chase closure, love, or understanding. You walk through life quietly, eyes sharp, heart intact, energy protected. You show up without explaining. You leave without warning. And the world feels it, not as hostility, but as command. You are no longer the open flame that flickers for anyone passing by. You are the cold clarity of winter, honest, undeniable, necessary. And if people can't survive your cold, they were never meant for your warmth. In the next section, we'll explore how this coldness becomes more than just protection, and how it transforms into quiet dominance in every space you enter. You don't raise your voice anymore. You don't slam doors, write long messages, or beg to be understood, because now you understand something deeper. The most powerful presence in any room is the one that doesn't need to prove itself. Coldness becomes your gravity. People feel it when you enter. They adjust. They second-guess themselves before speaking, not because you threaten, but because you carry the weight of someone who's seen everything and still chooses silence. There's no need to bark when your stillness already echoes. You no longer seek dominance through conflict. You carry it through composure. And ironically, that's what unnerves them most. You don't need to win arguments. You don't even need to have them, because you've mastered the one response no manipulator can handle: no reaction. You sit in your sovereignty while their chaos circles the drain. They wanted you loud, emotional, chasing, but you've become untouchable, not because you're cold in spirit, but because you're precise in energy. Clarissa Pinkola Estés wrote, "If you have ever been called defiant, incorrigible, forward, cunning, insurgent, unruly, or rebellious, you're on the right track. You've stopped apologizing for your instinct. You've started building a kingdom from your restraint." This kind of coldness is rare. Not the coldness of numbness, but the coldness of power that no longer explains itself. It's when you look someone in the eye and say absolutely nothing, and yet they feel every word you didn't say. It's when your boundaries no longer need justification, when your no is final, when your absence becomes your response. You become a mirror people can't lie in front of. Their projections fall flat, their games collapse, because your silence forces them to meet themselves. That's why they fear you now. Not because you changed into someone worse, but because you stopped accommodating their comfort. You became the version of yourself that doesn't flinch when misunderstood, doesn't panic when alone, and doesn't entertain those who once fed on your warmth. You stopped being easy to read, easy to reach, easy to use. You replaced kindness with discernment, generosity with distance, empathy with watchfulness. And they don't know what to do with that, because they were counting on you needing to be liked. But here's the secret they'll never admit. This coldness, it commands more respect than all your past pleading combined. Because now, your presence isn't an invitation, it's a decision. You choose where you go, who you see, what you respond to. There's no more negotiating your worth. You walk away before it's requested. You disappear before disrespect gets comfortable. You lead without needing attention. And ironically, that's what makes people follow. The dominance they feared was never loud. It was never aggressive. It was never cruel. It was simply this: clarity. The kind that cuts through manipulation like glass. The kind that says, "I'm not here to be liked. I'm here to be sovereign." And when you carry yourself like that, the room changes before you even speak. In the final section, we'll explore how this coldness doesn't make you cruel. It makes you free. You don't chase peace anymore. You carry it. Not the kind that requires agreement or closure, but the kind that comes from walking through fire and deciding never to burn for anyone again. You're not harder now, just cleaner, lighter, emptier in all the right ways. You no longer carry stories that weren't yours to hold. You no longer carry conversations that ended in silence. You've let them echo and fade. And in that emptiness, something unexpected grows. Freedom. Not loud, not celebratory, but steady. You don't owe anyone your softness. You don't owe anyone your explanations. You don't even owe them your presence. What once felt like coldness now feels like sovereignty. You're not emotionally unavailable. You're emotionally self-contained. And those who mistake that for cruelty were never interested in understanding you to begin with. Anthony Storr, in his book Solitude, wrote, "The capacity to be alone is the capacity to love. It may look like withdrawal, but it is strength. It is fullness, not absence." You used to believe you were broken because you distanced yourself. Now you realize the distance is what made you whole. You've stopped looking for safety in other people's hands. You've stopped explaining your pain to those who only listen to answer. You no longer ask, "Do you understand me?" Because understanding is no longer your currency. You've outgrown the need to be decoded. You know what you are now. You know the worth of your own company. The silence that used to haunt you now feels like home. The solitude you once feared now feels like armor. You're not lonely. You're clear. You don't confuse proximity with connection. You don't confuse attention with care. You've peeled away the layers that beg to be chosen, and underneath them stood someone who no longer waits to be invited in. You carry your own keys now, your own fire, your own oxygen, and when people meet you, they feel that. They feel the boundary before you say a word. The coldness isn't distance anymore, it's definition, a clear perimeter between what is allowed in and what never will be again. There is no revenge in your silence, no hidden message, no performance, just stillness, just the quiet strength of someone who no longer bleeds in public. You've learned to suffer with elegance, to rebuild without witnesses, to speak only when the words are sharper than the silence. And in that stillness, that cold, quiet command, you've become untouchable. Not because you can't be hurt, but because you've stopped inviting those who wound with kindness. You've stopped giving explanations to the confused. You've stopped proving your worth to the blind. You've stopped kneeling at the altar of being understood. And in that renunciation, you've become free. You don't belong to anyone now, not even your past. You walk clean, alone maybe, but sovereign, and no one can touch that. If this reached the part of you that no one ever listened to, then don't keep it in silence. Share this with someone who's still begging for answers from a locked door. Let it be the message they never got, but always needed. And if you want more like this, don't subscribe for entertainment. Subscribe because you're done being explained away. Subscribe because coldness is clarity, and you're finally ready to see.